my name is Charlotte Markey, and I am a professor of psychology and health sciences at Rutgers University. I am starting my 21st year at Rutgers. And I have been studying eating behaviors and body image since I was a graduate student, so for over 25 years now. And about 10 years ago, I started really wanting to write and present information to more public audiences. I've published a lot of research in academic spaces, but I've come to appreciate across my career that what the public knows and what research scientists know about some of these topics is not always in sync. And so I think it's really important for those of us who do research to make the findings available to the general public. So in my efforts to do that, I've written a number of books, the latest of which are part of a body image book series. And one is for girls, the body image book for girls, Love Yourself and Grow Up Fearless. And the other one is for boys, Being You, the body image book for boys. And a third one will be out actually in a year or so.
And what is the third one?
The third one is actually for late teens and into adulthood. So sort of picking up where the books for younger kids left off. So the idea is, okay, now you're through puberty. Now,
now what? It's crazy.
You still have a body image, it turns out.
Yes.
Now you're heading into adulthood, and there are other issues like your relationships and how they affect how you feel about yourself, and maybe the emergence of other mental health issues or substance use issues. And all of these impact how we feel about and how we take care of our bodies. And so body image remains sort of the framework through which I try to talk about physical and psychological health more generally.
So what is your own personal relationship to body and the impetus to study this? And then I'm going to ask you more boy specific questions.
Yeah, so I think I've always, as far as I can remember, been interested in these issues, and two early sort of formative experiences are probably most relevant. And one is that I took dance. I was a ballet dancer quite seriously when I was young. And so there was a lot of focus on my body and a lot of discussion about bodies and eating what you shouldn't be eating in that really pretty toxic environment.
Yes.
That was in the
like a nice way of saying it. Yes.
Yeah, that was in the 80s mostly. And there's been some change in the dance world since then.
But not as much as you would think.
And not nearly enough is what I was going to say.
Yeah.
But, it was really kind of the heyday of, I think, body toxicity in that world then. So that was just part of my, growing up experiences. And when you don't experience other things, you don't realize that it's not appropriate or normal to talk about cutting out foods or to talk about needing to lose weight, pre-puberty, right? Like if that's just what you've always known, then you think that is healthy. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, the emphasis was in training on, making sure people didn't gain too much weight, like that was the worst thing in the world. I think what's going on to this day now is that a lot of medical professionals are still trained in that tradition where they're taught to be concerned about weight and weight gain. And so they're not necessarily in touch with the most recent science about this, which suggests that dieting is apt to be more detrimental to a child than being perhaps a little bit heavier.
Right.
And in fact, when we look at morbidity, mortality across the lifespan, being overweight is less of a health risk than being underweight. So, there's just a lot of research that has been done on these issues, and it's nuanced, it's complicated, but it never, ever points to children should be dieting. In a perfect world, we'd start talking with our kids about eating and weight issues from the time they're very young in such a way that they felt comfortable in their own skin and they felt an appreciation for body diversity. So they didn't feel the need to look like any one particular type of body. So if you had a child who was a little bit bigger, they just thought that was normal, just the way some people have blonde hair and some people have brown hair, right? That this is just sort of part of human diversity. Unfortunately, we're not the only influences, or fortunately, we're not the only influences in kids' lives.
Right. Right.
So even if we do our best to sort of make that the lesson in our homes, they're going to get messages from other places, their kids, and their classes, or their teachers, or their doctors even.
Yes.
And so sometimes then we have to try to counter these messages that suggest that being a little bit bigger is unhealthy or undesirable in some way. And we need to really make it clear to our kids that that's not necessarily true at all, that people come in different shapes and sizes, that this is not the most important thing about you as a person. And it's also not a clear indicator of health. And that's where the research has really been advancing, right? So if your kid is eating relatively nutritious food, usually, right? Not all the time, not every single day, not every single meal, but just mostly, and is a little bit active, sort of regularly, then that's it. It doesn't have to be like hours of activity every day and lots of carrots and celery sticks. Like, it doesn't have to be like the focus of their lives.
Right.
But
Because
just,
that creates eating disorders.
right, that creates a whole nother set of issues.
Yes.
And so it's really tricky because you want to try to nurture good habits, but not at a cost, right? You don't want your kids to become compulsive or worried or concerned about these issues.
Right.
And I think sometimes people who know me personally, who know that this is what I do for a living, probably think that I venture too far in like the other direction, because there are days where my kids will hardly eat dinner. They're not hungry, but then they'll have dessert. And I'm sure, other people witnessing some of this as they've watched me raise them have probably thought, what is she doing? Like, doesn't care about what they're eating, right? Or, they'll have pizza for dinner and they will not have a fruit or vegetable with it. Like, they just have pizza. That's what we're doing sometimes.
Right.
And believe it or not, that hasn't just been lazy, that's been very intentional. And that I think it's more valuable. My professional opinion, coming from both research and some practical experience in this field, is that it's more important to have kids who can take or leave most foods, who don't feel like it's this big deal, who don't feel like they have to sit down and have a certain thing for dinner, and that it's really stressful. We want them to pay attention to their own physiological cues of hunger and satiety. And we want them to enjoy food and not have this be a source of stress in their lives.
Right.
So yes, eating carrots is awesome, but not if it makes your kid freaked out about, every little thing they're eating. I do think one of the best things we can do for our kids when it comes to how they approach food in their bodies is to try to sort through our own issues. And it's hard because most of us who have kids now, who are living at home, were raised by parents who had a very different philosophy about these issues. And, you couldn't have dessert if you didn't finish your dinner, and you had to clear your plate, and you had to eat certain things. And it was sort of scripted in a way that made it clear that parents were in charge and kids were not. And there was a certain way to do this. Mm-hmm. And what happened then as a result is we have a generation of people who lost a sense of their own physical needs because someone else was making all those choices for them.
You start crying. That's so apt. Yes. Yes.
And so,
yes. Yeah.
I mean, and I can't tell you how many people I talk to who are both, parents of our age, and then also, trying to like do better for their kids because, I have this one story I love. This woman who told me, if she didn't finish her dinner, and then she used to have to just like go sit in the laundry room with her food until she finished it. And and it's like, she was raised by immigrants, and these immigrant parents just felt like wasting food was just like the worst thing you could do.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't that they didn't love her or that they were trying to be abusive in any way, but it in some ways is just like the one end of the spectrum. Like, out of respect for us and what we've done to provide for you, you will finish this food and you can just like go sit in the laundry room with your dinner plate.
And you'll eat it and you won't like it.
I bring up this example because she's told me that then it's like she would be trying to find these ways to like hide the food, like stuff it down the sink, or like she just wasn't hungry or she didn't like it. And it was part of what created a really terrible relationship with food in her body for her, is because she just never kind of stood a chance in terms of thinking this through for herself. And she felt like she was a bad person for not doing this. And so there was a lot of self-loathing. And so, again, that's sort of an extreme example, but now we have that generation of parents often trying to do better for their kids, appreciating that that kind of parenting was not helpful, probably. And it's tricky because in order to sort through our own issues and be better parents when it comes to eating and body, we have to really like leaf through all this baggage. And for some people, I think that can mean therapy, even that can really mean like, talking through it, figuring it out, making sense of it, maybe even appreciating that they don't have to always love their bodies or don't have to always feel super comfortable with the approach they're taking as a parent, but they just understand that this is what's going to be better.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to break a cycle.
I'm wondering what the main differences are for young girls' body image stuff and boys that you've found.
Yeah. So some of this I knew from doing research, which most of my research as a faculty member has been survey research. And so a lot of this I knew, but I didn't, I think, completely internalize until I started actually interviewing kids one-on-one when I was working on these books. And it's not like all of a sudden I was like, wait, this is the opposite of what we've been saying. It just hit me differently. And I want to admit that because I think it's valuable to know that there's like this large body of research, right? And we've had thousands and thousands of people who've been studied. And then there's also these stories that help to sort of bring that research to life. And so the combination of those experiences is really important in helping me anyways to see what these gender differences are.
Yeah.
And when I talk to young girls as young as 10, 11, 12, and I can just say something like, tell me about your body image, or tell me about how you feel about your body, or tell me how you eat or how you think about your eating habits. And they just start talking. Like they know what I'm getting at. They have practice talking about this.
No.
And if I say that to a boy, they will look at me like I'm confused, like they're confused. Boys don't tend to use the same vocabulary to talk about these issues. And they see, even from a young age, body image as a girl issue. And so even if a child at 9 feels some insecurity about their body, or may even appreciate a term like I am dissatisfied with my body, they wouldn't own up to that necessarily, because in doing so, they would be suggesting some camaraderie with the girls who are very comfortable with us.
Totally. But it also goes back to every single expert I've interviewed. It all comes down to misogyny and homophobia. Really? Because
no, it's fine. I know. Yeah.
Max of being girly or gay.
Yes.
The boys want to, eschew, like they don't want to be part of that, but that's human. And so that's what I'm trying desperately to do with Built Up Boys, is to not feminize boys, but to give them that whole range of not only emotional vocabulary, but the ability to express dynamics and dissatisfaction and happiness and body autonomy.
When I'm working on these books and I'm talking with kids, I always have parental consent and I have child assent. And so everyone is, clear what I'm doing. And I ask the parents and the kids also, can I acknowledge you in the book as someone who contributed? Because it's important to me to essentially thank them, to acknowledge them for
Yes.
contributing to this work. And when I worked on the book for girls, every single girl, every single parent said, yes, that's fine. And when I worked on the book for boys, pretty much all the parents said, yes, that's fine. But about half the boys said, no, don't acknowledge me. Like they
Wow.
didn't want their name in the back of the book in the acknowledgments.
Wow.
And I felt in most cases like I developed rapport with these kids. I had a male interviewer also. So if there was any concern about, sort of gender dynamics, I would have him do the interview. He was
Yeah.
trained. Um, so I don't think it was like they didn't want to help or they were uncomfortable with what they had shared so much as they didn't want, like, God forbid, like their friends or something someday realize that they were part of a body image book. That's so not
Oh,
boyish.
right.
So
And that's so fascinating. What has been the response from parents or boys from the work, from the actual book? Like, I'm just wondering, because to me, the book helps change culture. And so if the book helps change culture and then the culture normalizes this as an issue for boys as well as girls, it makes me wonder if possibly there could be more comfort around owning your story around that. And I'm wondering if you have any anecdotes or experience post book.
I think I've been surprised. I have a lot of parents and a lot of clinicians say this is really needed and they're really appreciative and they really get what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
And I still, though, also get some parents, not experts or clinicians so much, but parents who will say, like, I don't think my kid needs that, or this isn't an issue for my son. And I mean, I'm not going to argue with people about their assessment of their child's, mental and physical health, but in my mind, you can't have too many resources when it comes to helping our kids achieve mental and physical health.
Yes.
And
Especially when it's at it's such a problematic state right now, right? Like
yes, it's
still,
really alarming,
yeah.
the data that's been collected in the last 6 months or so to a year in terms of young people's mental health. And I think sometimes maybe it is just a public misunderstanding about what we mean when we talk about body image. And people are all too apt to think that this is just, are you happy with like how your hair looks versus, a much more holistic definition, which is the approach I take, which is, are you comfortable in your own skin? Are you comfortable with who you are? And I think every parent wants their child to be comfortable with who they are. That's pretty fundamental. We also don't want our kids to be suffering long term. We don't want them to be hating themselves or ashamed of themselves or afraid to eat something. I mean, I just think these are such sort of fundamental components of who we are. And it's so painful when you see that in a child, and especially if it's a child you are a parent to. A lot of people, young people and adults, boys, girls, whatever gender you identify with, feel insecurity and confusion about these issues. And it makes sense. Of course we do. And then for girls, how does it manifest? For girls, it manifests in the way we're kind of used to thinking about these issues, right? Women and girls trying not to eat certain things, trying to be more active, a lot more restriction. Sometimes that restriction becomes purging or binging. But it's kind of the more sort of stereotypical disordered eating.
Yeah.
And with boys and men, it often manifests in ways that I think so interestingly, we are apt to initially perceive as healthy, because it may be over exercising, but when it's a boy, we think they're just really athletic.
Wow.
And it's like cutting out all sugar. But, even your family physician would say, well, that's great. Right.
Right. Like
Or
it's okay to like be on keto when you're 10 and working out to get swole.
right.
Right.
But if you're a 10-year-old boy, you're doing it because you're like a talented baseball player in the making. And so people are like, oh, great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what he's got to do.
Right. That's what he's got to do.
Yeah.
He's like just days away from the Olympics, obviously. you know? But if it's a girl, our stereotype still is like, oh, wait, no, okay. It's like we identify that as kind of problematic more often at this point, I think. Not always, but more apt to, because the manifestation is different. And for boys, it's like protein powder is such a big thing, and supplement use is such a big thing. So about 40% of teen boys, even in the US, are using some kind of supplement. And these are not FDA approved in the US. It's not clear that they're safe for developing bodies. There are some states that are trying to make it illegal for them to be purchased by children and adolescents. But it's legal. It's perfectly legal. And most parents don't think it's problematic.
I was going to ask you, what are like three of the biggest, and there could be more than three, but three of the biggest like pieces of misinformation that people really need to know when it comes to like healthy mental, emotional, physical well-being?
So focusing on boys, there's a misunderstanding often that boys actually do need more protein, or that their dietary needs are really different from girls. And although they may be a little bit different, they're not hugely different. And so this is part of why supplement use and protein intake can become sort of this path to disordered eating even. Most of us in the US and developed countries get plenty of protein. It's one of the only nutrients
You're like,
we're like on target with. So we don't need to really worry about this typically. If you have a kid for whatever reason who's a vegetarian, then you might want to attend to it. But even then, you're probably making peanut butter sandwiches and it's fine.
You're good. Okay, good to know.
So big piece of misinformation, this whole idea that like boys need protein, or men do it too.
Okay.
So that's one thing. Another would be that you have to be skinny or kind of wasting away to be engaged in disordered eating or diagnosed with an eating disorder. And weight and eating disorder diagnosis is not reliant on weight typically. And so especially for boys and men, we see disordered eating that may not involve restrained eating. It may involve binging, or it may involve a more sort of over emphasis on quote unquote healthiness, right? What we sometimes call orthorexia. And so you don't have to be skinny to have an eating disorder. Is what's really important. That's a misunderstanding. And it's especially relevant to boys and men, who make up about 1/3 of all eating disorder cases. And the majority of people with an eating disorder, in fact, are not underweight. Right. So you cannot tell by looking at someone that they have a maladaptive relationship with food or their body. Right. So that's really important. I think just the idea that that boys aren't dissatisfied with their body, right? That parents just think this, that it's just a common misperception. And we have research suggesting that up to about 75% of adolescent boys have some body dissatisfaction. So that's, pretty clear data suggesting that most boys are not comfortable in their own skin. Are they as distraught as girls always? Well, maybe not. Are the numbers a little bit better for boys than for girls? Yeah, but they're not great.
They're far from good.
Right. I mean, just because it's not 90% doesn't mean that we don't have a problem here. There's this one study that was published a few years ago of Australian boys. And I can't remember if they were 6 or 8, but it doesn't actually even matter, because it was half of them said that they wish they had more muscles, or more muscles would make them look more attractive. And what's noteworthy here is this was pre-puberty, right? So you're not going to develop any kind of notable musculature pre-puberty, really. It's just not the way our bodies, our hormones and everything works. Right. And yet these young boys who are essentially children are already starting to recognize that people think muscularity in boys is important, that they value it. And it fits with this whole stereotype of being male means being strong and tough and looking that part. And I think something that's valuable to start talking with boys about is, especially if they show interest in weightlifting or something, why? Especially if they're young and or it isn't at all for a particular sport or something. Like, do you want to be strong? What, so that you can defend yourself, so that you can get in fights with other people? Like,
Yeah, like what are we valuing here? And
what is right? I mean, because if you start to really think about it, it actually feels like a much bigger issue and a bigger problem, right? Like if young boys are growing up feeling like they need to be physically strong to protect themselves, like, wow, that's like a much bigger issue than, that's not just a body image issue.
yes.
Right. Or if they feel like they need to express their manliness in this physical sense, I think that's also really problematic in terms of what we're valuing as a society and what messages we're maybe inadvertently even sometimes sending.
Yeah. And it's the same with that stoicism. So if boys are told, hey, distance yourself from anything deemed as feminine in terms of emotion, so you don't cry and you don't let yourself be vulnerable, and that's just human, let's just say that's human, then what does that do for your relationships later if the research shows that the closest relationships you'll have are the ones you can be the most vulnerable and the most yourself? But if you're not even in touch with your own self, how are you going to do that? So we're like also hurting relationships or the potential of relationships. And if you don't have a good relationship, how are you going to be a good community member? Like, so it affects everything, from work environment to family environments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, so we're not just talking about like, you want to raise your son to feel good about his hair or his biceps. You're raising a child to feel good about themselves, to feel comfortable enough with themselves that they can be vulnerable around other people, that they can hopefully learn to be reasonable communicators, right? This is not a superficial thing.
Let them just be reasonable communicators. I'm
maybe
hoping
that
for
was
good communicators, but I hear you.
no, that was a good catch. We should aspire for more than reasonable, but so,
that they would be good communicators. I didn't mean
right.
to shut you down.
No. We want our kids to be good communicators. Like you said, we want our kids to have healthy, adaptive relationships and to be productive members of society. And, I mean, these are very lofty ideals, but I think that on some level, almost every parent feels this. Like, I don't think people would be listening and disagreeing with these ideas. And I do think to a certain extent, if we want our kids to get there, then we want them to feel good about themselves. I don't mean that in like a 1980s self-esteem movement kind of way.
Not like Stuart Smalley.
Right. I don't mean like, we just only compliment our children or whatever. But I do think that we have to then keep in perspective, how are we getting there? And we're not getting there by, making them sit in the laundry room and finish their dinner.
And we're not getting there by having the attitude of my son doesn't need this, which is what you were saying that you come up against, right? Like my son's fine. And then that's not being curious about whether or not your son's really fine, especially if they're less prone to admit that they're not fine, right? So that takes bravery on a parent's part and curiosity on a parent's part to be like, maybe I don't know my son as well as I'd like to, and I'd like to, right? It just takes vulnerability across the board, I think, to really like step into a new space. Yeah.
And I think, I will admit in my personal experience of having, my kids are teenagers. My son's almost 17 now. My daughter is 15. And even as someone who does this for a living, who thinks about this and talks about it every day and reads about it, it's easier for me to talk about this with my daughter. I try with my son. I hope I've done an okay job. Time will tell. I think it's important to be humble about that and to not just act like, oh, yeah, this is what you do, step 1, 2, and 3, and then it's all great. No, it's, this is like a day by day process. And we do our best. And oftentimes we have to go back in, right? So it's like, yeah, I get shooed out of the room. Um, trying to have like, the like 8th conversation I've tried to have about like consent or something in the last year, because I'll see some news story that I'm horrified by. And I think my son is never going to do this. He's going to know better. I have to make sure he knows better, go up to the bedroom with these like great ideas, and it just doesn't always
No.
get you where you think it's going to. So there's a lot of, I think, repeated efforts when it comes to parenting, and a lot of saying like, I don't know if you were really paying attention when I brought this up last week, or I'm not sure if you really understand why this is really important to me. Like, it's really important to me that you grow up to be respectful of yourself, but other people also, or whatever it may be. And sometimes I think we just have to keep saying it, and hope that we get there.